Acts 23, 11 to 35. The following night the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." And when it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There were more than 40 who made this conspiracy. And they went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food until we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you as though you were going to determine his case more exactly. And we are ready to kill him before he comes near." Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush. So he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. And Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him." So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, "Paul, the prisoner, called me and asked me to bring this young man to you, as he has something to say to you." The tribune took him by the hand, and going aside, asked him privately, "What is it that you have to tell me?" He said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of their men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they have killed him. And now they are ready, waiting for your consent." So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, "Tell no one that you have informed me of these things." Then he called 2 of the centurions and said, "Get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix the governor." And he wrote a letter to this effect. "Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency the Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against this man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him." So the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. And on the next day they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. And when they had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul also before him. On reading the letter, he asked what province he was from, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive." And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. So we return to our study of the book of Acts. And this is part 56. And we're in chapter 23, which we will finish today. There are actually 28 chapters in Acts, so 4 chapters to go after today. But I have to tell you that Paul has quite a few things still that's going to happen to him before the end. But just to refresh your memories, last time we read about how Paul had been brought before the Sanhedrin by the Roman tribune because he was hoping to find out what the Jews had found so objectionable about him, because there'd been a couple of riots with Paul, you might remember, and the tribune still didn't really understand why they'd gone all crazy, what Paul had said and what was really setting them off. So he brought him down to the Jewish council to see if they could determine what was going on. But that inquest turned into a violent political and religious squabble itself between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the tribune was forced to rescue Paul yet again from another frenzy. It just seemed that if not for the Romans, Paul would just be literally torn apart. They just seemed to be set against him and wanting to kill him and do violence to him. Now, Paul had been warned that he would face trouble, of course, and he certainly had, and yet there was more trouble that was yet to come to him. But it is at this point, during the night, and this is where we pick up in our scripture today, locked away in the barracks, that Paul is personally visited by the Lord Jesus. And I think it's just the phrasing in this particular translation, I think, is particularly useful, because it says that the Lord came and stood by him in verse 11. And that's the title of my sermon today, and the message that I want us to understand, that the Lord stood by Paul. And this is a part of his providence that he now demonstrates in this passage, which we will analyze. So the Lord stands by him in verse 11. Take courage, he tells Paul, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome. And apart from these being words of encouragement and of comfort, these words also categorically tell us that everything that's transpired to Paul right up to this time in Jerusalem and right up to this time where he's been under all of this attack was all according to God's plan, according to his providence, because he says here that he's pleased of that Paul has faithfully testified to the facts about him in Jerusalem. It's what God wanted him to do, and he did it, and God arranged it to be that way. Paul can take courage because whatever was yet to come, it too would be according to God's providence. And you can see what this is. You must testify also in Rome. So whatever's coming is going to be aimed at getting Paul to Rome so that he could testify about Jesus there, just as he'd already done so in Jerusalem. Now, providence is different to the miraculous. When God works miraculously, God sort of interrupts the natural law, the natural world. He contravenes natural law. This is a miracle. He suspends natural law by his will. So, for example, when Peter walked on the water, that's a miracle, isn't it? Because water normally can't support the weight of a human being. I remember once a lovely man who was my pastor many years ago in Australia. He was he and his kids were swimming in a pool, and his kids were saying, "Go on, Dad, you can do it. You could walk on water." And so he's trying to work up faith, that he could do it. "Go on, Dad." His kids are saying, "We're with you, Dad. We're watching." And he said he was really trying to do it. And of course it didn't work. He just went splash and he went right in. It wasn't God's will, was it, at that time, for a miracle to happen? But miracles do happen. And so we shouldn't be shy to not pray for miracles. But miracles aren't the only way that God acts and achieves things. Because when God moves in providence, it's different. Things happen kind of naturally, it seems. People still make their own choices and they do their own thing. But behind the scenes, God somehow weaves these natural events into a supernatural tapestry of his own design. His complete will is nonetheless enacted through the natural world and the natural choices that people with their own independent wills are making these choices. And yet God nonetheless does this directing, this amazing sovereign ability that only God has to bring about his purpose without violating people's sovereign will. And this chapter here, chapter 23, has often been said that it doesn't really advance any real doctrinal truth. It's mainly historical narrative, just telling a story. But although one isn't advanced directly, doctrine is still present in this chapter, and the doctrine is the providence of God. And we've been learning about this, haven't we, in Edgar's study in Esther. Esther's been dealing with this issue of the providence of God. Even though God's not mentioned in the book of Esther, God is very present there because he's arranging the whole thing behind the scenes, isn't he? He's the mastermind, and he brings about his purposes, which in Esther is the deliverance of his people from a genocidal threat and judgment against the enemies of his people. And here in our passage today, we have an example of God's providence in the New Testament. Esther's an example of it in the Old Testament. Here's an example in the New Testament in his dealings here with Paul. And the thing is, the reason why I bring this up is because in this passage there's at least three obvious and almost exaggerated demonstration of God's providence, of Jesus, if you like, figuratively. I mean, he literally stands with Paul, but he also figuratively stands with Paul, if you like, because he's faithful, he backs Paul up, he protects him, he gives him favor, and yet not really through miracles, but through natural means, not through the miraculous. And like in Esther, here there is a very real threat made against God's servant. And we read from verse 12 that some Jews, just as Haman did in Esther, these Jews make a plot to kill, just like Haman made a plot to kill. These Jews, and maybe they're the same ones who started that riot in the temple, numbering more than 40, here we read that they take an oath to neither eat nor drink until they have killed Paul. So these guys are pretty hardcore. They really mean business. They hatch a plan of attack and they conspire with the chief priests and elders to lure Paul out of the barracks by asking the Roman tribune to bring Paul out to the council on the pretext of further examination. But in reality, their intention is to ambush Paul and kill him before he even got there. Now, let's take a moment to underscore how depraved and shocking this is. Remember, these are the Jews who think they're really devout, who think they're so much better than the Gentiles. That's one of the reasons why they're angry at Paul, because Paul is wanting to say that God cares for the Gentiles. They think Gentiles are filthy, subhuman, they don't follow God. And yet here are these Jews, and they hate Paul and what he stands for so much that they're willing to lie, deceive, and kill in cold blood, despite the fact, the reality that Paul is innocent, and he's already appeared before their own ruling council, and he hasn't been condemned by them. And their co-conspirators, the chief priests and the elders, now these guys were the dominant force in the Sanhedrin, and the majority of these guys, the majority of the chief priests and elders, were Sadducees. And you might remember it was the Sadducees who were they'd been the ones who were most opposed to Paul and their religious political rivals, the Pharisees. You might remember Paul had said, I'm a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. And so I'm being accused here because of what the Pharisees believe. So the Pharisees kind of gang up behind Paul and say, there's nothing wrong with this guy. And the Sadducees say, oh, yes, there is. He believes all this rubbish. And then they have that frenzy. But these leaders who are supposed to be the most responsible, they're leaders of the Jewish nation in Jerusalem, in the temple there. They're supposed to be the most responsible and godly ones. They're the ones that have been determined to pervert the course of justice and commit murder upon God's chosen servant. Again, because this is not the first time they've wanted to try to kill God's chosen servant, is it? At least they are consistent. But it's at this point here, my friends, that we have the first act of providence. Because somebody hears about it. And that's pretty cool in and of itself, that this plot wasn't kept secret, it was discovered. But it wasn't just anyone, because God wanted to make a point. This is what I mean by God's providence here is exaggerated and obvious. Because you see in verse 16, have a look at it. Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Say what? Say what? The son of Paul's sister? I mean, up to now, we didn't even know that he had a sister at all. And yet here we find out for the first time in the whole Bible that Paul had a sister. And not only did he have a sister, but she and her family, because she's got a son, they're all in Jerusalem. I don't know if they lived there, if they happened to just be in there for the Passover or whatever. But here they are. His sister and his nephew, okay? His nephew in Jerusalem. But not just that. Somehow Paul's nephew, okay, was privileged enough to hear the whole plot spelled out crystal clear, as if he was right there amongst them. Now, I don't know if he was... he's obviously a young boy. Maybe he had some serving role or something. Maybe he was also being trained up as a Pharisee. I don't know what he was doing there. But for some reason, he was nearby or right in the midst of these guys when they're talking about the whole plot, and he heard the whole thing. How did he manage that? I mean, what are the chances, right? Not just that anybody, but a member of Paul's family would be right there at the exact time when these guys are talking about a plot to kill Paul. It's virtually none, is it? Virtually no chance. But it's God's providence, you see. This is God's providence. But God was just getting started. Because now that he's understood to be a Roman citizen, Paul was given generous visitation rights. So Paul's nephew was able to go straight to Paul directly in the barracks and inform him of the plot. So it was probably handy that the visitor was a relative. You say, I need to tell something to the prisoner. Well, who are you? Oh, he's my uncle. Oh, okay then. Lucky, huh? No, this is another example of God's providence. The Romans probably felt that they owed Paul because they had mistreated him earlier, you might remember, before they realized he was a Roman citizen. They had bound him, and they had threatened to, and they actually had started to prepare to scourge him before they realized he was a Roman citizen, which was against the laws to do what you could do to a Roman citizen without a trial. So consequently, Paul was able to get the attention of both the centurion and the tribune quite easily, quite readily. And time was an important factor, because we found out in verse 20 there that this was all planned to go down the next day. So there was no time to dilly-dally. But as part of the providence of God, this was able to be expedited very, very quickly. Not only could his family member, the nephew, come in and tell him what happened. But Paul was able to quickly have a connection to the tribune himself, because the tribune realized that he had done the wrong thing earlier, so he was disposed to be kind of helpful to Paul. All of these things are important elements to help make this thing work. So the second act of providence was the quick and decisive action on the part of the tribune. What's particularly noteworthy here is the size and the strength of the force that's assembled to transfer Paul safely out of Jerusalem. The entire Roman cohort in Jerusalem around that time was around 1,000 soldiers. And a quick count, if we have a look at the force here that's brought together. So we've got, let's see, in verse 23 there, 200 soldiers plus 70 horsemen plus 200 spearmen. So that's 470, which means almost half of the entire Roman cohort was employed to transfer Paul, just one prisoner, safely out of Jerusalem, away from the 40 or so conspirators. And this was done at the third hour of the night, which was around, it equates to about 9 p.m. for us. And note also that in verse 24, that Paul was also provided with horse mounts to ride to get him comfortably, safely, and swiftly to Caesarea, which was the destination that the tribune had decided to send him to. Now, such an overwhelming force was clearly designed to deter even the most fanatic group of assassins, but it's still, nonetheless, a bit overboard just to transfer one prisoner. It would be the equivalent today of Paul being put in a bulletproof car, surrounded by a motorcade of motorcycles and black limousines and armed police and FBI agents on either side. I mean, was this a prisoner? Or was this the president that was making its way down towards Caesarea? Actually, it was God's apostle. And it's another manifestation of God's providence on display, thwarting the murderous plot in grand style. It's like Christ showing his strong arm to defend and to ensure, to show the seal of approval and protection that God has upon his apostle this time. But just looking at the tribune himself, when I first read this, I thought, wow, this tribune's a pretty sort of stand-up guy. But it becomes apparent that the motivations of the tribune defending Paul were not altogether altruistic. I mean, Paul was clearly a spark for trouble for him. And in the tinderbox of an unstable Jerusalem, no doubt the tribune was actually probably happy to see Paul gone from his jurisdiction and rather passed on to the governor Felix in Caesarea, which is about 62 miles or about 100 kilometers away. And I think the tribune also seems to have felt threatened by the fact that he had mishandled Paul's rights as a Roman citizen by chaining him and intending to flog him under interrogation, which was a serious miscarriage of Roman justice. And you can see that in the letter that he writes to the governor. I don't know if you picked up on this when we looked at the letter here, which is supplied. In this letter to the governor, the tribune not only omits the whole episode about him binding Paul and getting ready to scourge him, not only does he omit that, but he makes out that he nobly rescued Paul from the temple riot after having learned that he was a Roman citizen. So what is he doing here? He's changing the story to present himself in the most favorable light there in verse 27. Because in fact, he only learned about Paul's citizenship after the riot, not before. And only after that Paul had been twice bound and that when Paul was about to be flogged for information. So he's not really representing the truth properly here. He's changing the story so that, at least to the governor and anyone who comes across this letter, that it looks like that he was the guy that did everything right, where in fact he didn't. He's trying to bury the fact that he did something wrong. And this stands in sharp contrast to Jesus, of course, right at the beginning there, who applauded Paul for faithfully testifying to the facts in verse 11. So there's a little bit of a contrast between the standard of God and the standard of men. Of course, the irony is, as we were saying, that the Tribune probably thought that this letter he wrote would bury any chance of his mistake being found out. But instead, what happens? Well, his letter gets preserved for all time in our Bibles to prove his duplicity. The lesson to learn here is that even when people's motivations or intentions are not honorable, God uses them anyway to achieve his purposes, because God cannot be thwarted. Now I want to move on to the third act of providence, which involves Paul being given more opportunity to testify before kings and to the governor of Caesarea, the seat of Roman government in Judea. Because prior to his coming to Jerusalem, Paul had been very active in all of his missionary journeys. You remember, he testified about Christ to the Gentiles and to the Jews wherever he went. He went into the synagogues, testified there, and he also had to stand before lesser magistrates. But nowhere does he actually stand before kings or the upper echelon of Roman government. And you might remember that when he got saved in Acts 9, he was actually told that he was God's chosen instrument to declare Jesus and the gospel before kings, before rulers. And here we have him starting to move into this phase. Even though Paul's freedom is curtailed, he is imprisoned, his ministry certainly is not. As I say, it's moving into a new phase, and through God's providence, Paul is now suddenly brought into the orbit of the powerful and the influential. He's also brought one step closer to Rome, which is the ultimate goal. And here we have the governor of the whole province who's promised that he will hear Paul. And additionally, in verse 35, we're told about where Paul is going to be lodged. He's going to be guarded in Herod's praetorium, or Herod's palace, which is a step up from the barracks in Jerusalem, isn't it? This accommodation favored his Roman citizenship. It sent a strong message to his Jewish adversaries, who were later to come to attend that hearing, that Paul was under the care and the safety of Rome. He was in their justice system, not the Jews. Paul most likely occupied a secure apartment with soldiers in his attendance. He had no reason now to fear for his personal safety. And because he spoke Greek, Paul most likely conversed openly with the soldiers and enjoyed a degree of freedom that was usually afforded Roman citizens. And in fact, Paul says in one of his later letters that his being a prisoner has actually led to the furtherance of the gospel. So Providence had transferred Paul from being under threat in Jerusalem to now being secure and connected to Rome in Caesarea without Paul doing anything. Now, Paul is a prisoner, but I want you to realize that something that's important throughout Acts, actually, and it's in verse 29, and that is that Paul's innocence is again emphasized. It's quite important because it's a repeated refrain that we come across every now and again, that Paul is an innocent man and what he preaches and what he does is not worthy of punishment under Roman law. Paul had committed no crime, and yet he was a prisoner. Initially, you might remember, because the Roman commander suspected that he might be a revolutionary of some sort and perhaps a source of trouble. Paul had been kept in custody then until the facts of the case could be discovered, and certainly for his own protection. But there's a scholar named F.F. Bruce, and he pointed out that one of Luke, the author of Acts and of the Gospel of Luke, one of Luke's prime motives in writing his history is to demonstrate that there is no substance to the charge against Christians and against Paul of subversion, that competent and impartial judges continually, repeatedly confirmed the innocence not only of Paul, but of the whole Christian movement and of Christian missionaries in respect of Roman law. So Luke, if you like, is trying to prepare the way so that the gospel message can safely be transmuted and spread throughout the Roman world. So Paul and Peter also had miraculously been delivered from jail cells before. You might remember that. We've had those occasions where the miraculous did break through, and Paul and Peter were jailbroken, set free anyway, miraculously. But this time, instead of getting Paul out, what happens? Jesus actually meets him in the cell and encourages him to take courage. He doesn't break him out. He leaves him there because it's part of his plan. And we often demand that Jesus deliver us out of our circumstances when what he wants to do is meet us right in the middle of them. We sometimes think that we're praying to Jesus to be set free when we are really only demanding an escape, when that's not what God wants us to do. There is a way of escape, but perhaps not that way. God wants to meet us in whatever we face at the moment. Many people want to experience the miracles. They like praying for miracles. They like looking for miracles. And it's good to pray for them. But it's also important that you be on the lookout for providence. Sometimes you don't see it. It's not apparent. But wait for it. Wait for it. One day you might just go, wow, I didn't see that coming, but look what God is doing in these circumstances. What seemed like it was just normal life, well, it wasn't. Because remember, God's like that director behind the scenes, setting the controls, moving things and directing things where he wants them to be moved. That's the providence of God. So now as I conclude, I need to address one final thing. And it's the thing which you are all thinking about, that you're all wondering about. And that is, what happened to the 40 guys? What happened to those guys? Did they all die of thirst and malnutrition? Their sworn task now completely thwarted? By the time Paul got to Caesarea, they must have been getting really hungry and thirsty and sweating bullets, right? Well, no, having made that foolish vow, they most likely went to the chief priests and asked to be excused from their vow. There is provision in Leviticus 27, 1 to 13, where you can be valued in terms of the vow to be forgiven it, if you pay a certain amount. And if you're not able to, the priest has the freedom to give you a little bit of a discount so that you can be relieved of your vows. And in this case, the priests undoubtedly probably kept the price low because they were co-conspirators in this whole thing. I mean, the corruption here is just mind-boggling. But yes, the ancient rabbis allowed for 4 types of vows to be broken. If your vow was simply a vow of incitement or vows of exaggeration or made in error, or they couldn't be fulfilled, well, this led you to have quite a few doors to be able to get out of fulfilling your vow. So, yes, these guys probably didn't follow through and keep trying to kill Paul until they dropped dead. They probably went and got themselves excused. And there's a few examples in Scripture of people who make very, very silly vows. So, and I think that's part of the reason why Jesus, of course, taught that making vows was mostly not appropriate for his disciples. In Matthew 5:33 to 37, on the Sermon on the Mount, have a listen to this when Jesus talks about making vows. He says, "Again you have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn.' But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it's the throne of God, or by the earth, for it's his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. Do not take an oath by your head, For you cannot make one hair white or black. Rather, let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. So to conclude here, the Lord stood by Paul. Jesus' physical presence that night in the barracks with Paul was a unique manifestation. But Jesus has promised every believer, that he will always be with them in Matthew 28:20. I personally live by, I'm always looking for the providence of God. And I continually get surprised. And I just never knew that I would end up in a place like this, preaching to you in this situation here. I couldn't have made this happen. I was happy in Australia. I never dreamt that I'd be living here full time, married to one of the most beautiful women in the world. But, God arranged it through his providence. And here I am. So my testimony to you is the providence of God is very real, and we need to live by it and look out for it and expect it. That is a position of faith. That's saying, God, I trust you with my life, and I want you to use my life to your glory. And so, Lord, I'm looking for your guidance, looking for your deliverance, looking for your plan, and you'll show me. I personally live by this, and I hope you are now encouraged to do the same. Because the truth is that Jesus stands by all of his disciples, whether we see him or not.